Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Vermeer and Proust, Realism and Bathos, a little patch of yellow wall. Phantoms, what have you left? What underground? What place in which to be is not enough to be? You go, poor phantoms, without place, like silver in the sheathing of the sight as the eye closes. How cold vacancy when the phantoms are gone and the shaken realist first sees reality. The mortal no has its emptiness and tragic expirations. The tragedy, however, may have begun again in the imagination's new beginning, in the yes of the realist spoken, because he must say yes, spoken because under every no lay a passion for yes that had never been broken. Wallace Stevens, Esthétique du Mal. Well, hi everybody, and just so there's no confusion, I'll define bathos right from the get-go. So the dictionary definition, especially in a literary work, an effective anticlimax created by an unintentional lapse in mood from the sublime to the trivial or ridiculous. And it's that relationship between the sublime and the trivial or the ridiculous that I want to explore with specific reference to the concept of realism, which I first explored in the previous video, and with specific reference to Vermeer's painting, which I'm going to show in a second, A View of Delft, and also, because I'm going to be doing it in the new year as part of a reading group, Proust's In Search of Lost Time. And what I'm always looking for excuses to do is A, talk about Proust, but B, show why he's worth reading. And in terms of being one of the most difficult novels just to get through because of its length, I wanted to talk about the current trend where everything has to be digested and presented in little digestible chunks. And I'll use a chocolate analogy, as you'll soon see. But what is brilliant about Proust, in my mind, is the fact I'll be quoting little bits from him, but in a sense that completely undermines the point of reading Proust. It's that overall experience. So to be fair to me, which I do like to be, that's one of the reasons I really want to do the whole book in the new year, to really try and, as an antidote to this contemporary tendency we have to reduce everything to bite-sized pieces. So this is the picture of View from Delft. And there's a certain section which I'll read from shortly in Proust, in volume 5, The Captive of In Search of Lost Time, where he talks about this particular painting in quite an emotional, poignant way. So if you can just have a quick look, this is in more detail. This is without some of the foreground, just to magnify it. So don't worry, you'll be returning to this, but this is Vermeer, and we'll be exploring him through Proust's eyes. But then also I'm using that as a jumping off point to present. I've done videos very early on about Adolph Menzel, a German painter, who's well known in Germany, but not so well known outside Germany. And I'm fixated on him. I think he's absolutely brilliant. So we'll explore how he relates to some of these themes about realism and bathos. So I've thought about this long and hard. And I think Quality Street, this brand of chocolate, British brand of chocolate for non-UK viewers, this is a tin, I think this is from the 1970s. It's not the most modern one, but I wanted to find one that was more reminiscent of my childhood, gorging myself. So the 70s was a bit more appropriate. And it's, as you can see from the label, it's a collection of different types of chocolate. So these are, just for the nerds, the chocolate nerds amongst you. And I must say, can I just get this off my chest, because I love so much about America, but your chocolate, oh, it's awful. So these are the British, good old British, what we built an empire on, chocolates. And I want you to focus on the one in the middle, the purple one, because these are all the others. And to the left of it, I think there's a caramel one. But they are by nature, so to speak, a mixed bag of chocolates. And there are some toffees there. And the round, large, yellow one was a really bland toffee. And the whole point of Quality Street was when you used to get either a huge tin or you could buy smaller bags loose in the shop, you couldn't just pick out the ones you wanted. You got all of these. So people had their favourites, but I think for most people, it's fair to say the purple one was the thing, that the particular chocolate most people identified. And I honestly think, I'm making a joke, but there's also a serious underlying point behind this. When they actually started making the purple one and identified it and sold it on its own, it marks the decline of civilization, a bit like Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, because the whole point about enjoying a chocolate like that, I'd argue, is that you have to consume it within the context of all the other chocolates you may not want, or you only understand how nice that one is if you've had to plough through all the other ones. And the minute you make the nicest one available all the time as a dedicated package of just that one chocolate, you've really missed the whole point of the essence of the concept of Quality Street, a brand of chocolate that was supposed to be a mixture. So it's what I'm identifying as what's wrong with modern society, but in the particular context of art, I think there are parallels in the sense that whether it's literature or painting, people want the highlights, people want the best little bits, people want the best hits, the famous hits. They don't want to do the work of learning to appreciate things in their full context. And just to repeat, that's one of the major reasons I wanted to do the whole of In Search of Lost Time, even if it's only me talking to myself by the end of it. Because you can only fully appreciate Proust if you read the whole thing and then understand some of the highlights, like the famous reminiscence of the Madeleine biscuit stroke cake, stubbing his toe on the cobblestones of Combray. All these things, the reminiscences he have that are really powerful to read about. And the one I'm quoting you today based upon this painting, The View from Delft, is from, like I said, volume 5, The Captive it's called. I think I've seen it translated as The Prisoner as well. And I'm giving you an excerpt, but it's towards the end of the book, and it's just incredibly evocative and poignant. And the poignancy stems from this notion of what constitutes bathos. And I'm going to argue that bathos, for me, is an essential part of great art. And you'll see it in the Vermeer, and you'll see it in Proust's reading of Vermeer in the novel, his interpretation of Vermeer's painting. And it's this tension between the sublime, the obviously beautiful, the stunning, the great art. But what makes that great art is the knife edge it walks in relation to falling out of the sublime into the trivial or the ridiculous or the banal or the mundane. And that's an aspect of bathos that I honestly think most great art needs an element of bathos, at least the risk of bathos, and have that tension in to be truly great art. But without more ado, to stop wittering, this is the painting that's been referred to, and this is a short excerpt from Proust, The Captive, I think it's volume 5 of In Search of Lost Time. At last he came to the Vermeer. He remembered as more striking, more different from anything else he knew, but in which, thanks to the critic's article, he noticed for the first time some small figures in blue, that the sand was pink, and finally the precious substance of the tiny patch of yellow wall. His dizziness increased. He fixed his gaze like a child upon a yellow butterfly that it wants to catch, on the precious little patch of wall. That's how I ought to have written, he said. My last books are too dry. I ought to have gone over them with a few layers of colour, made my language precious in itself, like this little patch of yellow wall. So this is Bergotte. He's a character in Search of Lost Time who's a writer, and he's ill, and he goes to the gallery to see this picture by Vermeer that he remembered from his young days, and it's Proust wrote this based upon his own direct experience. The same thing happened to him, although he didn't actually die, but it was the last time Proust ever left. It was the last time he ever went out from his apartment, when he saw the Vermeer painting in real life and had an attack of illness. He had quite profound agoraphobia. He went back to his apartment and never lived on for a while yet, but he never left his apartment again. So I just love this line, like this little patch of yellow wall. Meanwhile, he was not unconscious of the gravity of his condition. In a celestial pair of scales there appeared to him, weighing down one of the pans, his own life, while the other contained the little patch of wall so beautifully painted in yellow. He felt that he had rashly sacrificed the former for the latter. He repeated to himself, little patch of yellow wall, with a sloping roof, little patch of yellow wall. Meanwhile, he sank down onto a circular settee, whereupon he suddenly ceased to think that his life was in jeopardy, and reverting to his natural optimism, told himself, it's nothing, merely a touch of indigestion from those potatoes which were undercooked. A fresh attack struck him down. He rolled from the settee to the floor. As visitors and attendants came hurrying to his assistance, he was dead. That's my type of literature. But to be serious for a second, he's having a sublime experience of the painting, and then just the bathos of he thinks it's undercooked potatoes, and then he's dead. And I just love the way in which Proust does that. He doesn't try and just dwell on the sublime to the exclusion of mundane reality, the trivial. And that's the aspect of bathos I think great artists aren't scared of using. But I don't quite understand why, but people have disputed where precisely that the patch of yellow wall is supposed to be. And these are some of the suggestions being made by people. Now, it strikes me that A is just it's sloping roof. So unless you are arguing that Proust misremembered, or Bergotte, the character he's writing through, then it's not going to be A. So I strongly would argue that it's B and or C. But the B is next to the little sloping roof, so it strikes me that it's B. But I'm happy to say it's B and or C. But it does introduce actually an interesting aspect that in real life, when Proust had a memory of seeing the Vermeer, reproductions of paintings just weren't as common. Much more difficult to get hold of. And nowadays, I just think there's, it's an obvious point, but there's whole generations of people who are, it's completely alien to them, the idea that you could see a painting and depend upon your own memory for years or decades. And yeah, you might see the occasional reproduction, but even then, they just weren't widely available. Whereas everything is at our fingertips, and the implications that has for lived experience and memory. And I should have said the View of Delft, this painting, so it's Johannes Vermeer, and it's, they reckon 1660 to 1661. So this is just closer up, this image of the golden wall, little patch of yellow wall, little patch. And another aspect I'd just like to emphasize is the idea that one little, and it excuses everything I'm going to say from now on, because I want to use the Proust describing this little tiny patch of a canvas depicting the little yellow patch of wall as emblematic of how most people respond to art in general. So I'm going to now give you some examples now and then do some more theory, and then at the very end just show you some paintings that I think are my version of this particular painting in Bergotte's response. But it would be interesting to hear in the comments and your experiences of art that gives you a similar lifelong feeling or effect. The idea that Bergotte, this character, could have thought of this little yellow patch of wall his whole life, and it's the last thing he sees just before he dies. It's incredibly evocative, but it also goes directly to the associations people make and the evocations that art brings out of people. And art is a recurrent theme throughout In Search of Lost Time. And I'll be going through, when I do the reading group, showing you some of the art that's mentioned throughout the huge novel, because obviously it played a major role for Proust. Now, this is my version of that little patch of yellow wall. This is Grain Stack Snow Effect by Monet from 1891. And this is in the... at the moment, I'm not sure it's being shown, but when I was in Edinburgh, I lived there for about 7 years, I saw this in person. And it's sad in a way that it's the pointlessness of trying to show things on a screen. It just doesn't have the effect it does in real life. From the tip of that grain stack, there's a luminescence when you see it in person. And I don't know, the National Gallery in Edinburgh is probably overcrowded now, but when I used to go there, it was borderline empty all the time. It was amazing. But there was a luminescence, the sparkling aspect of the snow effect. And I just remember being shocked that on such a basic canvas with oil paint, an artist could achieve this quality of light coming at you. It was truly weird in a nice way. But this is an article about Vermeer and Proust. I'm going to start drawing more links between the two. And this is more general. Before I go into the specifics, I wanted to talk about this one particular quote that's quite general, but I find highly interesting. One notices that beyond the artificial divisions of method, or the accidental ones of chronology and geography, sensibilities and minds have always practiced an unlimited exchange according to the unpredictable impulses of affinity. One notices more and more that a creator suffers fewer influences than he chooses in accordance with his own unconscious expectation, and that the acceptance of an influence is less a capitulation of personality than its definition. It is always oneself that one seeks, sometimes through others. What we ask of them is to have already sketched our own shapelessness. Would it not often be more interesting to pursue the unknown springs of an accepted influence than its effects? So I'm the one, this isn't in the original, I'm the one who's emboldened and italicized key phrases there. But why I found this prelude to the discussion of Vermeer and Proust really, really interesting was according to the unpredictable impulses of affinity, all the way through, those things I've highlighted emphasize the way in which Hygge, I think, or Hygge, how you'd pronounce that. It's the way how people are either inspired or affected by art is almost preordained because it's in keeping with our personalities, or this is how artists work, I should say. So he talks about the artificial divisions of method or accidental ones of chronology, when you were born or where you were born, geography. Sensibilities and minds have always practiced an unlimited exchange according to the unpredictable impulses of affinity. So what we have an affinity to can be relatively random, but a creator suffers fewer influences than he chooses in accordance with his own unconscious expectations. So we have these inbuilt biases and affinities, and that's what tends to lead us on. The acceptance of an influence is less a capitulation of a personality than its definition. So we don't just give in to things. what we are tending to give into is already what we're likely to give into, because that's what our personality prefers. And I love this because I've noticed it as well. It's always been a belief of mine. It is always oneself that one seeks, sometimes through others. So I love observing people in relationships and how it's not about the other person. It's often about the person seeking either validation or a reflection of themselves in the other person. What we ask of them is to have already sketched our own shapelessness. So in reference to Proust specifically, Swann's Way is punctuated by two themes which evolve as he does. Venture is a composer, one of the characters in the novel. Venture, Sonata, and Vermeer. Odette is, at first for Swann, Odette is this, he ends up marrying her, but the girlfriend of Swann. And the first book is called Swann in Love. Odette is, at first for Swann, an image of the love for which she little by little substitutes the mediocre image of herself. Through the confrontation of Odette and Vermeer, Proust has traced this disintegrating process, which in life progressively replaces this imagined and temporary fancy born of desires, and to which we give immediate shape to someone just met. Fancy which life reconstructs piece by piece, detail by detail, out of real and experienced elements, eventually to take the place of the fictitious being whom we took him to be. So I love the cynicism of this. Swann has this idealised notion of Odette, and we, the reader, get a strong sense that she's quite a banal person, very shallow in some ways. But the way it says here, Odette is at first for Swann an image of the love for which she little by little substitutes the mediocre image of herself. So he has this idealised image of her, as most people do of most other people they're close to. And slowly but surely, 20 years later, picking up their underwear, all the illusions are dispelled. But Proust has traced this disintegrating process which in life progressively replaces this imagined and temporary fancy born of desires. So the way in which the human imagination driven by desire works, and to which we give immediate shape to someone just met. So the people you've just met, they're like a receptacle for these projected desires and your imaginative impulses, and often they bear no relation to the actual person, which, as you soon find out, the beautiful phrase here, trace this disintegrating process as reality, or may not, but reality either bites and you understand the person you're really with, or you indulge your delusion and cover up for all the things that have become more and more obvious about the person you're with. I'll be quickly moving on. But I just thought, in terms of Vermeer and Proust, this example of the role in which our imagination plays, this is obviously the most famous Vermeer painting ever, A Girl with a Pearl Earring from the circa 1665. And I did do way back at the beginning of the channel, a video on this particular painting. So I won't witter wrong, so I could spend the next 2 days talking about this. But it just fascinates me that this of its time was almost like fancy dress. This was not what someone would be wearing in Holland at the time. So it's a very exotic turban she's wearing. The pearl earring itself is not real because it's just oversized. The chances of a woman being able to wear a pearl like that at that time would be exorbitantly expensive. It's just not realistic. And you've got I'll just limit my comments to saying you've got the way in which the head is almost, there's a torque based upon the turban, and it's very ambiguous. Is the face turning towards us or about to turn away? There's the black background, which I'll talk about more in a second in relation to other painters. There's the use of the colour, the blue and the yellow reflected and alternating. And there's the obvious reflections, not only in the eyes, the obvious reflection of the pearls in the eyes, but also on her lips, and the little touch of white teeth that you can see. So this is highly idealized, but what I like is to keep on the theme of the talk, the concept of bathos, the fact that it should also be obvious to anyone watching that, any contemporary viewer at the time, that's not a real pearl. So there's already an element of bathos, and perhaps more to contemporaries of Vermeer at the time. The bathos might be clearer because it's such an obviously exotic, anachronistic outfit she's got on. So there's a little bit of the trivial already contained within the depiction of the subject. And then to contrast Vermeer and to analyse Vermeer and Proust in relation to other artists, for the artist there are only two solutions: draw upon dreams or draw upon external reality. Vermeer and Proust precisely occupy the same intermediate position between these extremes. Between the realist like Mieris, who I'll show in a second, who reproduces what everyone sees, and the visionary like Rembrandt, who creates an unknown and unrealizable universe, Vermeer and Proust scrutinize and fix the real, but give it the colour of their souls. So apart from the terrible Americanized spelling of colour, it's a great phrase. Vermeer and Proust scrutinize and fix the real, but give it the colour of their souls. And I just ask you to concentrate or focus on that, the notion that Vermeer and Proust precisely occupy the same intermediate position. If you think of a scale, on the one end you've got realists like Mieris, which I'm going to show you in a second, and then you've got someone like Rembrandt. So one's very realistic and one's very imaginative. And according to this writer, Vermeer and Proust sit in the middle. So it's their approach to realism that isn't purely imaginative, and it isn't purely realistic. It's more subtle than just being purely photographically realistic. So this is Frans van Mieris the Elder from 1660, so very contemporary with Vermeer. Lady at her toilet, it's called. Obviously, toilet meant something different in those days. And a little yappy dog. We'll talk about dogs more in a second, but that's not my favoured type of dog. So that's an example of Van Mieris and the realism. And then you've got this is Rembrandt. So this is called The Conspiracy of the Batavians under Claudius Civilis. Again, almost exactly the same year, 1661 to 2. And they were a tribe from the Holland area, Netherlands, who rebelled against the Romans in, it was called the Batavian Rebellion, 69 to 70 AD. And he's an odd character, that the Claudius Civilis, the king here, rebelling against the Romans, wearing the crown, he's one-eyed. And there's a whole story behind the painting. I just wanted to show it because if you actually look closely in the background, I think it's supposed to be set, unless I've completely misremembered it was supposed to be set in a forest. I think you can see a branch above the king's head and trees in the background. If I've got that completely wrong, I apologise. But also the actual painting itself, it was much, much bigger. It was designed for the town hall in Amsterdam. And it was put up there. It was a huge big canvas, 5 metres by 5 metres, I believe. And then it was taken down. There was a disagreement between the town elders. So Rembrandt, they didn't like certain aspects. So Rembrandt took it back and cut it down to size so that it would be easier to resell and it wouldn't be placed in a public place anymore. But initially, at least, when it was 5 meters by 5 meters, this huge big thing, it was designed to be seen from a distance. And it was very high up. I think it was 6 meters up. But this is probably a more well-known picture by Rembrandt, Balthazar's Feast from 1635 to 8. But this point about Rembrandt being much more imaginative, and he's not going for realism. So against the, uber realism of Mieris and this much more imaginative approach to realism from Rembrandt, Vermeer just gives something different. This is circa 1660, The Milkmaid. And I believe the thing on the floor on the right is a foot warmer. Proust expressed it in a theorem. Genius consists in the reflecting power, not in the intrinsic quality of the reflected spectacle. Differences of time, of society, of environment give to the dreams of one the calm and bold colour of warm sun on the white enamel of a tile from Delft. In other words, that's Vermeer. To the other, Proust, the troubled and moving colour of the smoky air of towns. But both conceived of art in the same way, a gaze placed in itself on that which surrounds us. So I'd ask you to remember that phrase, a gaze placed in itself on that which surrounds us. So if you buy the argument, Vermeer and Proust, according to René Huguet, is they are joined by this particular way in which they present a gaze placed in itself on that which surrounds us. And I'm going to use Adolph Menzel later on as an example of someone who does something very similar. But that's the crucial thing, the way in which their approach to the concept of realism is quite unique. It's not purely photographic, and it's not excessively imaginative, more so like Rembrandt. It's much more subtle, and it begs the question we'll see with Menzel shortly. True realism actually involves a way of portraying how we experience seeing something, not just in an optical way, but as a physical, what they call a somatic, a bodily way. And I'd argue that contemporary society, with the loss of art being in a privileged role in society, we lose a lot of the nuance and the ability to see the world in a somatic way, in a felt way. If you're going to use an acoustic parallel, bass sound is non-directional. You feel it, but it's not obvious where it's coming from. And we'll see that in some of the examples I'm going to use later on. There's an effect of art, both visual and literary art, that makes you feel an experience in a not a completely non-directional way, but it's not as unidirectional as the more obvious art. And this goes to what truly is realistic art, or art that qualifies as realism. It's the arguably true realism involves an aspect that is psychologically and somatically or bodily true, not just visually true. And there are relatively few artists who can do it, and it'll be interesting if you're convinced by the examples I give you of the artists I think who do it. So Vermeer and Proust diverge from an apparent realism in a common conviction that one can replace imagination by sensibility. They both have a true vision, that is to say, felt and not imagined, yet distinct from the common and collective vision which constitutes realism. So the argument being made here is there's more to realism than dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. But there's more to realism than just, what does it say, that one can replace imagination by sensibility. I think the argument is it's not an either or. True sensibility is informed by imagination and vice versa. So this is in opposition to the other pictures I'm going to show you. This is Woman at the Window by Caspar David Friedrich from 1822. I think this was his wife he was painting. And just a couple of brief things I'd say is the way in which the woman's dress is almost the same colour as the wall surrounding her, the interior wall, and even everything's green. And she's even looking out, and you're seeing her silhouette superimposed upon a green tree-lined background. So she's part of the scenery almost, but you get a strong sense. Caspar David Friedrich, I think Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog is the same thing. You're seeing someone's view from behind, and what that does is emphasize the concept of subjectivity. You're seeing something from somebody else's point of view, and the idea that you're seeing a point of view in this is emphasized by the almost like the crosshairs at the window pane is like a crosshair. It's a view of the world being seen by somebody else. So it's clear that we are watching somebody else's view. And at our distance, we're seeing it from their point of view, but obviously they are distant to us. Now, the question is, in the examples I'm going to show you after this, is there a different way? This is one way of seeing in a realistic, this is a form of realism. I'm not disputing that, but are there more realistic forms of realism, I suppose, is the question. So one could say that to sketch Proust's aesthetic, and that's how it was spelt in the original, is to do a commentary on Vermeer. Proust denounces the almost universal error which he admits having shared, and which in a work of art appreciates and judges through it, as through a transparent surface, that which it represents. So this goes against the idea that you can just represent things clearly. Inversely, Proust, through the apparent reproduction of the real, will learn to look at the soul of the artist. All value is in the gaze of the painter, he said. The real in the work of art is the colouring substance which one injects into the transparent body in order to make it visible. The matter through which the sensible quality of the artist becomes concrete and perceptible. The branch on which flight poses, immobile. So this is all very wordy. So I want to give you some very specific visual illustrations using the painter Adolph Menzel. But I keep asking you to concentrate on particular sentences, but I just love this idea. The matter through which the sensible quality of the artist becomes concrete and perceptible. The branch on which flight poses, immobile. And to talk about bathos again, the concept of realism and bathos, in the subsequent painting I'm about to show you, it couldn't be more down to earth and trivial. And yet, as you will see, when you start to unpack this painting, there's so much in it. So this is an English balcony room from 1845 by Adolph Menzel. I think in German it's Das Balkenzimmer. It sounds better in German. And like I say, it's deceptively simple. The one thing to really highlight from the get-go is that the difference in the right-hand side and the left-hand side. The left-hand side is incomplete in terms of detail, and the right-hand side is fully detailed. And then in the middle of the painting, it's the complexity is added to because you've got the contrast between the billowing curtains, which have been, don't shoot the messenger, but some critics have said it's almost feminine, bulging shape, and the more masculine straight line of the door that you can see behind the billowing curtain. But that's mirrored, inverted commas, by the actual mirror, which is also lineal and, dare I use the word, erect. And then you've got the two chairs, but not just the two chairs that mirror each other. You've got the mirroring of the chair in the mirror itself, the image, the reflected image. And it's not totally clear which chair is being reflected. It depends. I'm guessing it's the one nearest to us, judging by, and this is something else to think about, what particular visual perspective is being assumed in this painting. Because the other thing is the way in which the floor almost seems to melt because of the reflected light. You've got light coming in from the right to the left, but you've also got light coming towards us. And the varnish on the floor makes it almost look like water. And the detail in the mirror isn't matched by what you'd expect to be on the left-hand side. So you could argue what's in the mirror could be further to the left, but that doesn't explain why we can't see the detail on the couch. The sofa on the left is just left unfinished. And that, again, is mirrored. I keep using the phrase mirrored, but this is what Menzel's doing. He's putting things in parallel all across the painting, but the unfinished sofa is mirrored by the unfinished painting on the wall. The way the basic wall paint has been applied. What is that? It's a weird, irregular shape. Is that some type of weird reflection, but it looks more like it's different shades of paint, or is it's someone painting the room? It's just odd, isn't it? And it's obviously deliberate, because if you look in the rest of the painting, there is very delicately painted curtain rails and the pattern, the flowery pattern at the top of the cornice of the ceiling. And then loads of people don't notice behind the chair on the right, I think that's a cat. Not the type of place a dog would lie in my experience, but... So to get into the direct analysis of this, mirroring or reflection in the Menzel is also what might be called perspectival, or better, aspectual in its mode of operation. We are made to feel that only from our present vantage point would those things, and he lists the various elements of the painting, appear precisely as they do. At the same time, the implication of our actual presence at or to the depicted scene does not give us means to assess the extent to which the larger thematic of reflection plus embodiment in the painting is a function of the embeddedness and contingency of our own reflective self-determining, which is to say, we are forever uncertain whether or to what extent the subjectivity we are led to intuit in the picture is in any sense ours. So apologies, it's very wordy. And I was going to say he's an odd writer. He's not an odd writer. Michael Fried, it's a brilliant book, this Menzel's Realism. But he is a very involved writer. But he makes some brilliantly insightful points, so you have to take the writing with the quality of the insight, I suppose. But he's just basically saying, with reference to that previous picture, it's actually unclear as to precisely, it seems to be a very simple picture of this notion of bathos. It's just an inside of a room. It's quite trivial. And yet from that, he manages to achieve something that's arguably quite sublime. And I think it's easier to make sense of it if you think of that as a representation. When Michael Fried questions to what perspective is being depicted and whose, it's someone's perspective who's more focused upon the right of the room than the left. So you could argue the painting's representing, in a very realistic way, to get back to this notion of realism, that's how you might observe a room. You may not really be fully cognizant of what's on the left of the room if you've just noticed the wind billowing in the curtain. So what you might actually experience in your brain is more akin to this. This is more realistic than a photograph that showed both sides of the painting equally well defined. And that's what you get to. I think this is the relevance to Vermeer and Proust. I think Menzel does something similar. He's actually providing something that's arguably more realistic than just a more photographic approach that records everything, but fails to convey the same level of psychological realism. So I mentioned the billowing curtains. This just gives you more detail on that. Aspectual seeing carries both a positive and a negative valence. It's both confirming and unsettling. On the one hand, we are fictively solicited to project ourselves into this pleasantly sun-filled space, an airy world that we are made to feel exists only for our being there to compose it. On the other hand, once we try to fix our bearings, we become immediately and anxiously aware of the thick material facts of our fictive invitation. We are made aware, that is, of the infinite series of such perspectives, both lived and unlived, at play within every act of perceptual cognition, a potentially horrifying experience for an integrated ego. So Cronin here, this concept of shaken realism, which refers back to the epigraph, the Wallace Stevens poem. What we think of as self-evident, realistic realism in art, to be truly realistic in a more psychological and affected sense, as how we actually live in the world and how we actively experience it. It's not like looking at photographs all the time. We live in a world full of screens and screened images, and I think we're deluded into thinking that they are realistic, when actually that's not how we experience the world when we're actually living in the world and not looking at all these damn screens everywhere. The distressing awareness of our merely projective mastery over the scene destroys the fiction of specular totalization posited by a mastering ego. The slowly evolving pull that one feels between these two possibilities, between fictive totalization on the one hand and the potential dispersal of the viewer's subject position across the imaginary scene on the other, produces the unmistakable effects of dislocation and disorientation. So just to go back, he's arguing that when you look at this painting more closely, you actually realise how we don't see the world in an integrated, controlled way. Our way of seeing the world at a certain level is actually much more disrupted than that. And this idea of dislocation, this is called the studio wall by Menzel again. Atelier-Wand, I think it is in German, from 1872. And I don't know whether it's just me, I just find this quite, the previous... I was looking for this phrase here. The potential dispersal of the viewer's subject position across the imaginary scene on the other produces the unmistakable effects of dislocation and disorientation. So given that this is by the same artist as the one painting the Balkenzimmer Das Balkenzimmer. I don't think it's a coincidence that he had this, the claim that the Balkenzimmer painting is all about dislocated perception may seem a bit of a stretch until you see this is also the type of painting that Menzel did. And on another occasion, if there's any interest, I'll do more on Menzel, but he also did some just like really classical court scenes. He had a great range. So some of his court scenes are like, they look like early 1800s when in fact they weren't. Or late 1700s, like really old fashioned even for the time he was painting. But then he also did, there's a famous one he did of a view from a backyard that again seems so simple, like the Balkenzimmer painting, but actually has got so much going on in it. It's amazing. But I'd be interested again in the comments. Am I the only one who justified in finding this really more dislocating and not upsetting, but discombobulating would be a good word, than it probably should be? All it is are these plasticasts, but the way they're arranged, it's quite disorientating. So back to the Balkenzimmer. Menzel's canvas offers a highly nuanced structure, keyed to but not exclusively consisting in relations of reflection that pointedly confounds any clear-cut distinction between actual and reflected elements, at the same time as it implicitly addresses or interpolates the viewer, who in effect is called upon to respond projectively to the multiple evocations of a subjectivity that on the one hand seems to hover everywhere we look, and on the other to come to rest, to condense and stabilise nowhere in particular. So in terms of realism and bathos, to repeat, it's such a basic room that's being portrayed. And yet, when you actually pay attention to how the realism of the scene is being portrayed, it opens up some quite disorientating conceptions of how reflection works. The literal reflection in the mirror and the conceptual reflection of how we make sense of the optical information that we're receiving. So the multiple evocations of a subjectivity that on the one hand seems to hover everywhere we look, and on the other to come to rest, to condense and stabilise nowhere in particular. So it's a Fried's repeated point that it's, when you actually delve into it, it's a very confusing painting. In Balcony Room, with its breeze-blown, light-struck and undeniably material curtains mediating the flow of light and air into the room, and also with its obliquely angled mirror, ostensibly reflecting features of the room that lie beyond the painting's left-hand framing edge, outside and inside, in more than one sense of those words, are in the end little more than inflections of a single, in crucial respects, seamless, pictorial and phenomenological field. And because that is the case, the viewer, at least this viewer, continually searches the painting as if for a solution that is not forthcoming. The inscrutability of the light patch on the far wall may seem as emblematic of this. So that's what I mentioned earlier. This is this very odd patch. So it's not a little yellow patch that Bergotte sees in the Vermeer painting, but it's Menzel's patch of bathos. So one of the implications of the Balkenzimmer painting is the idea that it's not just our ego, who we are, isn't just this passive receiver of images like some photographic device. So in reference to Schopenhauer, So Schopenhauer describes the emptiness of consciousness without the guiding force of the will behind it. So if we were just these empty vessels of consciousness, it is therefore the will, so this is Schopenhauer speaking, it's there from will and representation. It is therefore the will that gives consciousness unity and holds all its representations and ideas together, accompanying them, as it were, like a continuous ground bass. Without it, the intellect would have, a base, I think I should have said, without it, the intellect would have no more unity of consciousness than has a mirror, in which now one thing, now another presents itself in succession, or at most only as much as a convex mirror has, whose rays converge at an imaginary point behind its surface. So Schopenhauer here is just describing the difficulty. Without an intellect, it would have no more unity of consciousness than has a mirror. It's will that gives consciousness unity and holds all its representations and ideas together. So in philosophy, you have this idea, it's a perennial, never-ending question about what gives us our psychological unity in our heads. What's the thing that unifies our consciousness? And in the Menzel Balkenzimmer painting, it just shows you how fragmented our experiences and perceptions would be without a unifying, what Schopenhauer calls will. But then to give this as an example of what happens when realism goes down one particular route, this is very similar to the Ian McGilchrist material about left hemisphere versus right hemisphere of our brains, and how we live in a world where the left hemisphere that privileges geometry and mathematics and the type of mirror-like representation that Schopenhauer's talking about, that's only one limited aspect of true perception. So I've given this example before, but this is the Baptistery in Florence. And this is how in the Renaissance it increasingly became a mathematical structure to be captured. So this is Brunelleschi. I've shown this in previous videos. And I'm showing this in opposition to what Menzel is portraying. Menzel's portraying a lived, embodied experience of being in a room. Brunelleschi here was at the forefront of the Western tendency to capture things visually, in a relatively, ironically, because this is all about three-dimensional perception, trying to replicate it. But this replication is more one-dimensional than what Menzel's doing. Menzel is trying to get the full psychological affect. Brunelleschi is trying to capture the visual accuracy, but not necessarily the psychological accuracy. And I always go back to, I've mentioned it several times, but it's interesting. He had to put a burnished, polished silver top to the picture in order to capture the one thing that couldn't be represented, the contingency of the clouds just passing across the sky, which is something that you can't represent in a static format. But that's just the complete visual explanation of what he's doing. Very clever. Now we're getting on to a couple of... I'll start finishing off by showing you some, again, practical examples of what I think Menzel and, by extension, Vermeer and Proust do that relates to the Bathos, the relationship of Bathos and realism. So quoting Robert Vischer, Fried points to the heightened receptive quality of Menzel's engagement with objects. Objective empathy finds itself, as it were, through subjective sensation, and now imagines itself turning toward the interior of the phenomenon. Only now, by virtue of this central projection, exchange and return, does it take on a life of its own. It looks at its second self as it sits reshaped in the object, and intuitively takes it back to itself, yet without discerning it clearly or knowing why. So again, this is quite wordy and complex and verbose, But it's, if you don't quite follow it, my best way of explaining this would be just the concept of somehow getting inside via a visual representation, an embodied sense of living. That's probably worse than the way you described it. But rather than just keep wittering on, if I can just explain, I'm trying to remember, it was philosophically, this Vischer guy was a German philosopher, and he distinguished between, forgive my German pronunciation, it's Verstehen, which is some type of seeing something from somebody else's point of view. It's like a participatory form of understanding. And he made this distinction that hadn't been made before. He introduced a specific technical understanding of Einfühlung, which is empathy. So it was a body of philosophers who started to theorize about empathy, and arguably people like Menzel, Vermeer, and Proust are artists of empathy. So I think this Einfühlung, it was I'm trying to remember, it was Vischer. He did his PhD, his doctoral thesis. It was 1873, and I'm scrambling from the back of my head. I think the title was On the Optical Sense of Form, and I think aesthetics was in the subtitle, something like a contribution to aesthetics. But this is what I wanted to get to. It's called A Hand Holding a Paint Dish from 1864, and this is Adolph Menzel. And it's gouache. It's non-transparent water-based pigment. So it's not watercolour, it's non-transparent, but it's not oil either. And that has technical consequences. So again, it's about the bathos, the banality, the triviality, the mundanity of just a hand holding something, and yet what Menzel manages to make of it. And the realism that Michael Fried talks about in relation to this is, it's the tensile, it's the way the hand's holding it. And interestingly, Menzel was ambidextrous. So if you think of him holding this with his right hand, the idea is that the artist is painting this with his other hand. And like I say, he was able to flip between both hands. What's the definition of ambidextrous, isn't it? To speak of the hands as active scarcely captures the sense of inner vitality. I'm going to show you another picture of the hands in a second. Both pictures evoke, the closer we look, the more we become aware of an articulated interplay of bones, muscles, tendons, veins, the skin itself traversed by capillaries, as if the painter was seeking to make actual to the viewer, to render accessible as bodily feeling, not just the physical effort of holding the paint dish and the book, which we'll talk about in a second, but also going beyond ordinary sensation, the flow of blood and nerve impulses to and from the hands and fingers. The next image I'm going to show you is of him holding a book, and he gets a bee in his bonnet, Michael Fried. He convinces himself it could also be a piece of wood, and he's not convinced that it's a book, and he goes off on one. It's a bit odd. But just for the purposes of that previous image you've seen, he's describing, Michael Fried, the intensity of what lies within the physicality of the hand. The gouache medium reaches its zenith of effectiveness in these works. The dryness of the technique lending itself to the superimposition of distinct levels of hatched colour, hence to the evocation of an entire realm of the subcutaneous. I did say he's wordy, our Michael, isn't he? But I think this is what he means, the superimposition of distinct levels of hatched colour, hence the evocation of an entire realm of the subcutaneous. This was the painting Hand Holding a Book from 1864. So Fried claims that it could also be a piece of wood, and like I say, he becomes obsessed by this. I interpret it as a bit of a double bluff, so it's entitled Hand Holding a Book, and the fact that it's not really convincing, at least to Fried and company, that it is a book. I think that adds to the undercurrent of the notion of the accuracy of representing anything in a painting. But this is an interesting observation. Furthermore, the black backgrounds reminiscent of Goya forcibly restrict the viewer's attention, which has the effect of raising the experiential stakes to a nearly allegorical pitch. In this connection, the inference that both pictures, these hand paintings, were painted with the left hand reveals its deeper meaning. They are to be seen as evoking the liveness not only of the artist's right hand holding a paint dish and gripping a book or a piece of wood, but also of his left hand wielding a brush and applying paint to the image progressively being realised on the page. The gouache medium with its clear traces of paint application is appropriate to that effect as well. So Fried's making the quite bold claim that what Menzel's achieving is not just a pseudo-realistic portrayal on a two-dimensional plain piece of paper, a three-dimensional object, the hand and the dish. The actual act of painting it is being represented in the painting itself. It's like a painting about painting, and it's also a much more subtle version. If you've ever seen the Escher picture of a hand drawing another hand in an eternal loop, there's that subtle element to it. But for fans of Goya, who I'm going to look at in future for certain, this idea of the black background reminiscent of Goya. So this is the 3rd of May 1808, execution of the Defenders of Madrid. So it was painted, I think, 1814, a part of the series of black paintings. And I know they're, markedly different topics, but I think the point Fried makes about the use of the black backgrounds is valid. And this is a man mocked by two women, another one of the black paintings. You can just see the point about the black background. In the first and more memorable of the two pictures, so the one I've just shown you, there is the motif of the scuffed white porcelain paint dish, which explicitly, though in a sense perversely, thematizes the act of painting. We are invited to imagine the brush in the artist's left hand painting the dish held in his right, which is to say, depicting with absolute verisimilitude on the flat surface of the paper the shadowed close-range concavity of a smallish object that initially presents itself as the brush's natural home or source. The perversity concerns the fact that on closer view, the paint dish turns out not to be used as a holder of pigment. Instead, it is empty except for two dark rivulets of paint running down the lower left inner wall, as the dish is held tilted with its open top toward the viewer. The operative fiction seems to be that a dollop of liquid pigment was placed by the painter at the bottom of the dish, and that the two rivulets record the passage of time needed for the painter to execute his picture, even as the exact moment depicted has the rivulets just starting to drip down below the rim of the dish, as if the painter had just barely won a wager that required him to finish his picture before the rivulets dripped onto the floor. Viewed in this perspective, the ultimate subject of hand holding a paint dish turns out to be time itself, and this is why it's highly relevant to Proust, or rather what I shall call lived time, time circuited through the living body of the painter holding the dish and painting the picture, time as still another modality of embodiment. But time and embodiment are linked not only by life, but also, inescapably, by death, which seems to be the import not only of the black background, but also of the funereal black and white decor of the image as a whole. Seen in this light, the blackish shading along the underpart of the forefinger and thumb appears positively sinister, charged with a deathless that gives the picture, for its technical brilliance, a tragic cast. The drops about to fall, like threads of life about to be cut, take part in this as well. I know of no comparable evocation of the interwovenness of life and death in all 19th century art. I need to look this up, but my senile memory tells me there's one of the Impressionist paintings, maybe one of the absinthe painters, where there's reflection of the green of the absinthe on the figure's hand. And in those days, because of the widespread nature of syphilis, there's the implication. So that's another example of a similar thing that Menzel's doing. But this idea, where are we? Like threads of life about to be cut. I think Fried's making reference here to this. This is Zen Atelier, his studio from 1890. It's another Menzel ink drawing. And what you may not see there, in close-up, you see the muse looking down, but the cherubs cutting the threads of life. And then I do love it, you mentioned the black background, but just the way in which Menzel uses colour. There's the crenellations of the back of the hand, but it's just the gradations of brown. And it reminded me of another Goya painting, The Dog. Because I'm a massive dog lover, but this it's such a sad, and it just like if I had to present one painting that summed up my philosophy of life, it's like a dog at the bottom of a sand hill in the middle of a sandstorm. It pretty much sums up what life's like sometimes. It's one of the funniest, saddest paintings I think I've ever seen. I think it's brilliant. But anyway, to drag all this back, to finish off, I want to give some personal examples, and hopefully it will spark in you your own responses to what this little patch of yellow wall that Bergotte, the character that Proust himself remembered for decades from this Vermeer painting. And I'm not, in what follows, I'm suggesting this is completely my personal subjective response to certain paintings. But arguably that's one of the aspects of realist art. Little, seemingly insignificant contingent details can affect you in really unpredictable ways. And this is what the whole, the last thing Bergotte sees, and this image of Vermeer that haunted Proust through his life. So this is a relatively insignificant painting by Ilya Repin, that I did a video on. Not this painting, but Ilya Repin's work. And I'm going to be returning to him. It's called Female Figure in a Landscape from 1883. Two things I'd ask you to concentrate on. The colour in the background. It's like evening's falling, and I just find that colour and the use of the trees. So I'm lying. Three things: the colour, the way in which the trees are portrayed, and then the figure of the woman. And that made me, again, this is purely subjective, that gave me the association with James Tissot. And I'll get to something that looks more like this, but bear with me. I just want to show you some other Tissot, which is more about just the form of women standing and the verticality that you can see in this Repin painting. So this is London Visitors from 1874. So the verticality is there, the woman standing is there. And I just really get amused by Tissot, the funny looks are quite interesting sometimes. And then with reference to Bathos, that's in the painting, just a random cigar. So there's a monumentality that's all about, buildings from the Empire in London. And yet he always often finds room for something completely contingent. And this is called The Secret Rendezvous, again by James Tissot, 1890. And it's not a great painting, I'm not claiming it is. But it's something about the trees in the background I associate again with this Repin. So I've just shown you a few examples from Tissot where the verticality he uses, that's what I associate with when I see this painting. But also back to the colour now. It's not exactly the same shade of colour that I'm about to show you, because this is much more the dying of the day. It's quite autumnal. It's a beautiful, evocative, maudlin colour. But there's like a little hint of this Klimt. So this is 1907 Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. So I'm not claiming it's the same, but there's just a little hint. And then again with Tissot, you get something that's somewhere in the middle. I don't think the light's as evocative as the Repin, but there's more of a hint of the Klimt colour. And unlike the Repin, there's not the directness of the gaze in the Tissot. Sorry, I think I said that back to front. This is the direct gaze of Tissot. This is called Orphan from circa 1879. But in the Repin, you just get the sideways. You don't get to see much of the face at all. It's much more oblique. But then you get another hint of the foliage in the background. The colour in this is it's not autumnal. Looks like almost the middle of the day, but in a heavily curtained room that's got loads of vegetation outside. So it's a different atmosphere again. But there's still something about the light and the use of the foliage in the background that's not a million miles. It's just, again, it's something about, I'm trying to describe how you can start making associations based upon, and this goes back to the quality street. Tissot, in lots of ways, I don't think is a brilliant painter, but because I've seen quite a few of his paintings, it allows you to appreciate paintings like this in a different way. And if we only ever looked at Girl with a Pearl Earring, similarly, I don't think we'd fully appreciate A View from Delft. So just to finish with, this is the little patch of yellow wall, and it reminds me to go back to the Wallace Stevens poem I quoted at the very beginning. You go, poor phantoms without place, like silver in the sheathing of the sight. As the eye closes, how cold the vacancy, when the phantoms are gone, and the shaken realist first sees reality. So I'd argue that simultaneously the bathos and true realism of great art. As the eye closes, how cold the vacancy when the phantoms are gone, and the shaken realist first sees reality. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Until the next time, all the very best. Take care.